Picking up immediately where the previous video installment had left off at, with the battle that occurred between the surviving heavy troop or company of the 1st of the 98th Cav, along with the surviving rifle platoon or mechanized infantry platoon of the rifle troop that had been intermixed with this heavy company at the time, where the Tu-22M had come in and laid waste to both battalion-sized elements or Cav squadrons, the 1st Squadron of the 278th ACR and the 1st of the 98th, as they together had been given the task by the HHT, or at least the surviving elements of it, after the downtown area and just beyond had been heavily showered by 300mm rockets from the A300 Battalion of the 83rd Artillery Brigade of the 83rd Group Army of the PLA, firing their short-ranged ammunition, their 300mm ammunition, into the downtown area and just to the slight south, as well as also an additional Tu-22M strike, as well as tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, itself a Trojan unit that had materialized on CCP regime properties to the east of Austin, where another battle was raging, firing DF-11As into this particular area, hitting buildings that had been requisitioned by the HHT from the state and federal regimes for their use. As some of the company-sized element, the HHT, the headquarters troop of the 278th ACR, encapsulating its command elements and its logistical assets, were safe beneath the highway segment wherein they had stored the vast majority of their logistical stores as a forward logistical site, as the Ellington Joint Base was the nucleus and nerve center of the city's defenses and prime logistical hub, wherein logistics were imported and distributed to the two forward chief logistical sites. The one of two had been overrun completely by a mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Brigade early on in the conflict, within hours of its initiation of hostilities, with this site, the last remaining site, threatened by the materialization of other PLA forces of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, including the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that the two Cav squadrons or battalion-sized elements had been tasked with defeating and pushing these forces away from the HHT's logistical site, only to fail and be destroyed in a well-laid trap set by the coalition for their destruction, with only a very small handful of these forces surviving and continuing on with their directive, only instead of attacking this force, they had swung to the slight southeast and attacked into the vicinity of the William P. Hobby Airport, which was being established as a mega FOB, as an air defense artillery battalion of SHORAD systems, their batteries equipped with the Type 625E, had moved into the William P. Hobby Airport, including along with the support battalion of the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as well as also a mechanized infantry battalion entering the area from the 113th Combined Arms Brigade to support them, as well as a mechanized infantry battalion and combat engineer battalion entering the area as well to the north, between the battalion that had been attacked by the two American squadrons and had held up these two battalions of combat engineers and mechanized infantry serving as their reinforcements, with this mechanized infantry battalion moving in to secure the airport and its vicinity, along with the armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade moving up I-45 and entering the area, as well as these forces would partake in the battle as it pertained to the mechanized infantry battalion of the 113th and also the armored battalion of the 60th Combined Arms Brigades moving into the area. Elements of the two battalions, as in company elements, would partake in the battle, as by now the armed reactionary civilian element that had essentially materialized in this area primarily from underground passages beneath the city, such as the sewers, maintenance tunnels, and drainage systems, as well as even basements that connected in some ways to some of these labyrinths of passages. They numbered approximately 270 in total number, and were now fighting alongside of these American military elements of the National Guard entering this area that had belonged to the 1st of the 98th Cav, which for all intents and purposes was now a completely defunct battalion-sized unit, as this was really the last of the major American combat forces apart from very tiny handfuls of the 1st of the 141st, an artillery battalion that had also been carpet munitioned by a Tu-22M flying over League City and unloading its payload upon them, with few surviving in the similar manner that the heavy company or troop and rifle platoon had survived. They eventually would be surrounded and destroyed in Alvin, Texas, by the PLAN Marines as they entered League City, forcing them to flee, as well as an outcropping of major civilian resistance to the direct south of this core metro area in Alvin, as they would take some time to fight through League City as well, as there would be armed civilian resistance there, with Alvin being the last major centerpiece of this resistance, as well as in the downtown area itself, as fighting here would go on for some time, as it would become a type of engagement where it would devolve into a whack-a-mole type of scenario for the People's Armed Police, which would be later joined by PLA elements. As before this would occur, after the fighting outside of the William P. Hobby Airport concluded, the last major logistical site would be rolled up as soon as the 2 mechanized infantry battalions from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade had finished clearing the flanks for this coming operation, as it would not be the forces that materialized east of them, but to the south of them, that would finish off this site before they too would proceed into downtown and partake in the fighting there, assisting in the wrap-up phase of that operation. As the fighting in this particular area was of a very brutal, savage nature, one typical of urban warfare scenarios, as the area had been thoroughly carpet munitioned by the very same Tu-22M that had flown over and begun dropping its munitions in this area before it covered slightly just off map the area where the rest of the 1st of the 98th Cav had been, just south of the 1st Squadron of the 278th ACR, who itself were they who had been destroyed on the ground by the Mechanized Infantry Battalion by the Buffalo Bayou Tributary, in addition to the Tu-22M and Su-27 close air support strikes. The area here, outside of the William P. Hobby Airport, encompassed a 2-mile east to west by 1 mile north to south area, and even a bit beyond, although the fighting that occurred just beyond this map segment of the larger battle was very small, as only 3 American tanks had left this map segment to fight 3 PLA tanks in addition to these 2 tanks, which formed one of the tank platoons, of the combat platoons of the 1 tank company of the armored battalion partaking in this battle, as there were only 2 combat companies, or platoons rather, 2 combat platoons of QN-506s out of the anti-tank company, which had 4 platoons of QN-506s and 1 headquarters platoon of that company. Only 2 combat platoons would be partaking in this battle with the tank company, although both armored infantry companies' combat elements would be partaking, as a platoon here, 1 here, and 1 here, were 3 of the 4 platoons of the armored infantry company, as the 4th platoon was its headquarters and logistical platoon, which stayed off map. And over here was yet another, as 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here formed the other company's combat elements, with its headquarters staying off the map just to the south. As this platoon and this platoon of tanks were part of a different tank company, as the 3 additional tank companies formed a very strong perimeter defense along with these 2 anti-tank platoons of QN-506s, and the mechanized infantry companies, besides the one in this area, as there were 5 additional as part of the mechanized infantry battalion moving into the area, would partake in the cordon of the soon-to-be megafob as well in its defense, with the fire support company partaking actively in this battle to support not only their one company operating in this area in their endeavors to flush out and destroy armed reactionary civilian elements in the industrial area of this map, but also assisting as well the armored forces in their battle in the destroyed neighborhoods in this area, as the fighting was again very destructive and gruesome. It took place in an area wherein the building materials of the former homes and other buildings in the area had essentially been pulverized, nearly dustified in many cases, and thrown from area to area, creating large rubble piles to where even the foundations couldn't even be found. They just consisted of rubble piles, some much taller than others, and included in this was even pieces of asphalt and also concrete from the curbs and sidewalks that had been thrown in with them, as massive craters existed in the roadways. Although they were not impassable, they made travel definitely difficult unless it was tracked vehicles that were traversing the areas. As it pertained to the fighting itself, multiple different types of munitions now filled the air. Everything from the dual-purpose anti-air, anti-tank missiles fired by the QN-506s, their primary weapon, which was their anti-tank weapon, being their dual-purpose missile, the anti-air/anti-tank, as it could shoot down close-range air targets. These missiles are very powerful, and also they, being the QN-502Cs, could annihilate tanks. As this tank had been destroyed by one and had its turret blown off and caught fire, these being fired from a distance, as this is where the smoke trail begins as it comes up off the map, coming in above these troops, running and bounding and covering, as this is part of a different squad that is laying suppressing fire of armored infantry troops, so that this squad of armored infantry troops in a wedge formation, this is the point man, this rifleman, this guy is part of the wedge coming back and off the illustration or animation, if you will, of the battle that's unfolding, and more, of course, off the animation. Type 96B, Type 96B, turret gunner, firing W85 heavy machine gun. Lots of carnage and morbid death and destruction, with limbs being blown off of many due to the sheer volume of munitions like Frag T shells from tanks being fired at a distance, as well as HE armor-piercing ammunition from 30mm autocannons, which were also on the QN-506, but also the VN-20s as well, as they possessed a 100mm main gun and a 30mm autocannon, the 100mm main gun being highly destructive as well, more so than even the 30. Although the 125mm tank gun was by far more destructive, and there was a variety of different ammunition types that could be utilized for it. Most prevalent as it pertained to destroying American tanks being the tungsten-based Sabo ammunition, of which China and Russia had the best tungsten-based Sabo ammunition on Earth, and China was the lead producer of tungsten in the entire world by an enormous gulf, which is why, with their metallurgy abilities, they were able to create the strongest tank armor in the world with their RHA and tungsten-based alloys, as China was also by far, by another massive gulf, the biggest steel-producing nation on Earth, in addition to aluminum and titanium and other key metals required for mass war production. And they had the biggest war industries on Earth to boot. As it pertained to their ammunition, they also had DU ammunition, although their Sabo tungsten ammunition was plenty enough to defeat an Abrams from the front. Although their heat ammunition could destroy an Abrams from side and back hits, from the front, the Abrams armor was very strong, and typically the heat ammunition, even from the potent 125, was not quite enough, hence the DU or tungsten ammunition being the best choice if firing at an Abrams from the front. Although, again, the side hits, the Chinese heat ammunition for the 125 was enough for the side and back to destroy an Abrams. But again, they were often fighting them from the front, hence the need for the tungsten or DU ammunition in this case, or their ATGMs. They also had the ability to fire ATGMs, which the Abrams did not from its 120 millimeter gun. As the troops also carried ATGMs, they carried the very potent HJ-08. They also carried lighter anti-armor weapons, like the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, which also had an anti-personnel rocket in addition to the anti-armor rocket. And their troops also had a light machine gunner in each squad, being the QBJ-201 5.8 by 42 millimeter light machine gun, same ammunition type as used by their riflemen in their QBZ-95 standard assault rifles. There were other types of rifles the Chinese military and paramilitary possessed as well that fired the same caliber, like the QBZ-03 and others, but the QBZ-95 was the most widely circulated of those types of caliber rifles. As the National Guard rifle platoon troops intermixed with the armed reactionary civilians, the chaos was palpable, and due to lack of ISR capabilities and communications capabilities due to the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, the disorganization and poor coordination was at an extreme level, to the point to where organizing any type of effective attack against the PLA was essentially a futile action, although there were tiny instances of successes, including the destruction of 2 of the PLA tanks from the PLA tank company that was partaking in this battle, as it was only 1 of 4 that were in the area, and also the destruction of the Mechanized Infantry Company from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, 1 of their Type 89A armor personnel carriers. The loss of 3 vehicles was ultimately a drop in the bucket, especially compared to the loss of life on the American side. Although it, at least in the near term, could be counted as a very small success, it wasn't enough to effect the outcome of the operations of the PLA in this area, and in the long run would be forgotten about soon after. This is a M113 armor personnel carrier on fire. It's been hit by multiple different systems and ammunition, including 12.7 millimeter fire from tank turret guns, which this had a reputation for easily catching fire. Some called it the rolling matchbox in other countries that purchased it, as well as during the Vietnam War, as the aluminum alloy armor could become flammable if circumstances were right. As rocket-propelled grenades filled the air, HJ-08s, HJ-12Es, QN-502Cs, laser-guided 70mm rockets from the QN-506, which also had armor-piercing capabilities, although not quite as much against tanks like the Abrams as the QN-502C, which could annihilate an Abrams. The 70mm laser-guided rockets were still more than enough for the Bradleys, or lighter in terms of American vehicles on the battlefield. And of course, there was its other weapons as well, such as the S-507 loitering munition, which was excellent against soft-skinned vehicles and certain light armored vehicles as well, and groupings of troops, 30mm autocannon, a scourge against troops and light armored vehicles, its 7.62 by 54mm coax, and its 6 25mm grenade launchers to boot against infantry formations or clusters. As in this battle, there's so many different occurrences going on this map, it's very difficult, especially on this map, to convey them all in any rational, coherent order, although it will be attempted, as always is the case. As this mauve-colored track segment here on Stilting is the passenger rail, the local train, the metro line for Houston, the PLA troops were trying to preserve it for its own use later on after the victory was assured, as these troops of these squads were going in and clearing these buildings, including this platoon operating up here of its 5 vehicles, sending in its 2 rolling T squads who are coming out of the backs of these armor personnel carriers, these 2 Type 89As, going in here and engaging in a firefight with these armed reactionary civilians inside of this building, many of whom having gone into buildings to look for respite, a place to regroup and regather themselves from the stresses and tensions of high-intensity warfare. Many would not find it as they entered areas that were under direct assault. As this was occurring, these vehicles, this Type 89A, this QB, or this VN-20 rather, moving up alongside of it as per SOP, staying in steady communications with the troops inside while they engaged enemy combatants by radio and also by combat data link, coordinating all their actions as they stayed outside with their double column rolling shield formations of troops behind them to either send them in direct support or leave them outside to look for any fleeing enemy combatants and engage and destroy them. As this was going on, and these actions were going on with 3 squads going in, 1 squad on the outside in the north, 1 on the outside in the south. These tanks were moving up here, this tank moving around the building this way, this tank moving up this way. These tanks moving up here and shelling this side of the building with heat rounds, with HE rounds, and even frag T shells on this side of the building here, while 130mm rockets slammed into this side of the building from one of the 2 firing platoons of the Type 63 multiple launch light artillery 130mm rocket systems, as also the PLL-05 self-propelled assault gun / mortar systems were arc firing their shells as mortars, their 120mm shells, which are very powerful, and landing on this building too as well. While that happened and this building was being cleared out, the tanks shelling this side of the building here and this building being hit by the fire support company's forces, these tanks had moved up here while these tanks were here, including this tank moving up here, and the armored recovery vehicle would move up here and be on standby as the combat was heating up. And already the American vehicles were already causing trouble, as this tank had moved into place before these tanks, having moved up here, were now beginning to be engaged by these armed reactionary civilians who in turn just mowed them down with their coax machine gun and turret-based machine gun, not even wasting a tank shell on them, cutting them all down, by which point this tank had already made it over here. Tank had come through here while this tank had already continued to proceed, although when it had arrived here, it had taken some fire from the vehicles over in this direction, from the mechanized infantry forces, including this Type 89A rolling up, at which point this tank was rolling back and forth, firing from around the corner, and although it hit this Type 89A and destroyed it and badly maimed the troops behind it, the armored recovery vehicle had moved up, retrieved the vehicle with combat medics in tow with it, attended to all the wounded troops, and also evacuated the KIAs back to the casualty collection point, and which was also the key logistical point, and also the prisoner of war collection point, or POW collection point, as well as where the captain commanded his company from, as it had also been surrounded by the 3rd combat platoon to add to the MRAPs of the headquarters platoon and for the perimeter security around the lighter skinned vehicles. As this event had happened with this tank, that was what caused the armored recovery vehicle to move up and be on standby in this area, by which point it was accompanied by the platoon of armored infantry from the armored battalion that had from the one of the two armored infantry companies within the armored battalion that had moved up into this area of hotel buildings on this block and this block, which catered to oil people, typically those that worked with these petrochemical plants when they came in on business, and now was a site of a heinous battle, as these armed reactionary civilians have been destroyed by this QN-506 early on with their 70mm laser-guided rockets and their 30mm autocannon, and also the armored infantry troops partaking in this as well, fighting them in these rubble piles and eliminating them with this QN-506. This tank had since moved up here to the end of these former buildings, while this tank was gradually moving up as well. At the same time as these actions were unfolding, actions over here were likewise unfolding. Early on, this tank had been destroyed by 125mm tank shells, typically Sabo, as well as also QN-502C missiles from the QN-506 anti-tank vehicles, which have some green around them because they were being fired at by the turret gunner before the tank crew was even able to put a shell in and fire it, and was destroyed rapidly, while these men were KIA'd by ISR-directed shells, typically Frag-T or HE, annihilating these tank crew members that were trying to exchange messages to coordinate their actions, as some had already been coordinating between these two different city blocks, although this tank had been destroyed early on by a tank shell fired directly at it down this street from this tank right here. What had happened was, as these armored infantry platoons moved in from this armored infantry company, of which these three combat platoons are a part, with their headquarters platoon just off map, these tanks began to move up and were beginning to fire at the tanks who, although trying to fire back, the laser and IR scrambling caused their shells to go off course, which would eventually cause them to learn that they would have to bore sight their ammunition if they wanted to get a good hit, although this would be difficult as the tanks were constantly moving, and they could shoot well on the move while they could not. And as this tank moved in and tried to do similar, it was fired at and destroyed by this tank as it moved and bobbed and weaved itself through the area, with this QN-506 on standby after having destroyed this tank. As this tank moved into the area, another ISR-directed tank shell would fall on it and destroy it as it moved to the end of this corner. And the rubble was not too particularly tall in this area, and the shell was able to hit and destroy it. Although this was not always possible, it was easiest when there was less obstructions in the way. As you can see, this tank is driving down a rubble pile, same as this tank right here on the Chinese side. And sometimes the vehicles would be close behind rubble piles, making direct fire weapons difficult to hit. Even if the shells could be arced slightly, it was still relatively difficult if they were directly behind a rubble pile. That being part of the complications of urban warfare. Although these APCs were hit no problem, these M113s, because they were out in the middle of the yards, or former backyards rather, of people, and were hit and destroyed by tank shells as well as anti-tank guided missiles, and more. These tanks, this one being behind rubble very close, was partly spared by these rubble formations, although this tank took some shrapnel engagement, as did these other ones. But this shell that landed right here also engaged these tanks as well, that took out these two men trying to spread messages between the tanks, as that caused this tank to move up hurriedly, and this one as well. These tanks tried to coordinate their activities, by which point this tank was moving up already, as again, so many things are happening at the same time, it's difficult to show it all in an order. I'm trying to convey it in the best order possible, with grenades having been used against these forces here and here by these QN-506 vehicles, and armored infantry troops firing at them as well, and as well as the tank turret gunner. These tanks moving up gradually, including this tank right here, firing at these armed reactionary civilians coming up out of the manhole cover. This tank fired at them while all this movement was going on before it then moved right here and held its position. With this tank coming down through the area, it fired over the rubble at this tank and destroyed it as this tank was trying to coordinate with this tank, which then led to this tank then moving off to outflank the other 3 American tanks that went off map, including this tank as well as it moved off map as well, to engage in an L-shaped formation, vectoring their fire in an L shape with the other 3 PLA tanks of their platoon. As that was going on, QN506s would continue to lay down supporting fire from sitting further back with the armored infantry troops providing mutual support, as depicted in this image, with the QN506s. Even though the QN506s were more than capable of holding their own against infantry, it was always ideal for there to be mutual support between vehicles and infantry because infantry could sometimes watch any blind spots. Blind spots in the sense of ambush spots. Although the ISR assets were superior and could spot almost any type of movement, there were times, rare times, such as using underground passages, where vehicles could be ambushed and destroyed via this method, such as what would happen to one of the PLA tanks. Only very narrowly was this tank destroyed. It almost was not. Although there were 20 Molotovs created by what would become a kamikaze Molotov platoon, or essentially 35 men that were able to put together 20 Molotovs that they'd been able to make with some gas cans, bottles, and some other implements that they had for the fuse mechs. And although this was very rare early on for there to be a whole lot of different Molotovs in use, they, having 20 of them, would manage to get 3 of them into this tank. Although the rest would fail and fail miserably. They would be cut down by the tank that was even under attack, as the turret gunner would fire at one prong and the coax at another that was coming right at them. While the QN506 would support with grenades fired into the area, and this one with 30 millimeter fire and 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax fire with its autocannon fire, and would devastate these men trying to Molotov this tank. Although again, they would only get 3 on the tank, it would be just enough to bypass the tank's own fire extinguishing system and would end up catching the engine on fire by getting hoses to burn and catch fire and ignite other fluids in the vehicle and eventually cause the tank to erupt in flames, cook off ammunition. However, the crew would survive, but not before they wiped out this entire grouping of 35. At the same time, others were coming out, being hit by 120 millimeter ISR directed mortar strikes, including the rest that got here. They were hit. And at the same time, this tank was moving into this area. It started to move again after this action had occurred. And then it would take position and watch this manhole cover after this tank had been essentially, for all intents and purposes, eliminated. Although the tank was eliminated, it was easily replaceable, although the 35 men that took it out were not, as they would leave this world and never return. As that had occurred and these tanks were moving up into the area gradually, they finally moved into position, this tank here and this tank here, and they watched this manhole cover with great interest, as it had cost them essentially their tank, as it was a very short distance from where this tank had moved right here when it was attacked rapidly by an outcropping of over, or nearly rather, several dozen men, as 35 had partaken in the attack. As that happened, this tank had moved here again, and this tank here watching the manhole cover. This tank then moved up and into this area, by which point these, at the opening, these armed reactionary civilians have been KIA'd, sending the rest across the street, where they briefly took position here, at which point this tank was moving up into the area and began to fire its coax and heavy machine gun at them, as the mortars had already since destroyed these armed reactionary civilians, causing them to flee and be cut down at that point. As that happened, this tank has since moved into this position before moving here, being fired at into the rubble by the main gun of this tank that had moved up here while this tank was busy fending off this attack. This tank had ended up having to focus in on this tank that now moved here, while these armed reactionary civilians had been KIA'd early on from this tank, from its turret machine gunner, as well as assistance from the S-507 loitering munition strikes that also wiped out these armed reactionary civilians. As this tank fired at this tank, eventually this tank would flee the area and end up playing a role in the destruction of the PLA tank as the two tanks were moving up the street. And this tank that had been moving out from behind and fired at and destroyed this PLA armor personnel carrier in the process and maimed horribly much of this squad that was dismounted and behind it, which is the only reason why their lives had been spared, but the vehicle had been destroyed and the driver and gunner KIA'd and had been evacuated. The VN-20 of this platoon moving up outside as the troops cleared this building out and moved across the street along with this Type 89A moving up and its rolling shield double column formation peeling right off behind the vehicle and straight into this building, while this VN-20 was dealing with these American tanks early on, as this tank had already been destroyed by fire from this lead tank of the two as they joined together and moved up the street with one tank scanning the back, one scanning the front. As that was happening, these troops were clearing this building as one squad had gone in from the south, and the two that went in from the north here went into the north of this building as the fire had been halted from the tanks and the fire support company on this building. As that happened, the Type 89A that had rolled up to the corner had now rolled over into this area and held this position, at which point, as this building was being cleared and a firefight with the survivors that weren't KIA'd by all the tank fire and fire support company fire into the building, were fighting inside of this building, these men tried to flee and were cut down violently by the heavy W-85 machine gun mounted on top of the Type 89A as they tried to flee the premises. At which point the squad that was outside in the north with the vehicle, as per SOP, that bounded over with the Type 89A, moved to the corner of this building as the two squads that went in through the north prepared to go and clear this building after finishing up clearing this building, while the other squad that went in through the south, as the squad that was on the south of the building itself, moved across the street with this tank as the tank moved up to provide it cover, the squad cover, while they waited outside as this squad went in. And now the squad and the tank moved to this corner together as per SOP while their squads were clearing out the inside of it. Then the squad of the three, of the one that went in through the south, not the two in the north, they went across and cleared this building with approximately 15 armed reactionary civilians inside of it, while this squad took the corner. And then this squad peeled out and scanned their sector of fire while they went tactically and bounded across the open spot in this parking lot between these buildings. They bounded across while they watched and held this sector of fire for them to tactically bound across safely while they held the corner. While that happened, this tank, again, was being engaged by the PLA forces, and they moved out of the way as soon as these tanks came into view and they could see them. They hurriedly got out of the way and went over this way between these buildings up in this direction where they were a little bit out of view, although the tank shells splashed into the corner of this building because they fired anyway as the tank rolled out of the way and slammed in the building, very narrowly missed the American tank. And as they went around to the building, they were trying to figure out what to do, as this tank that had moved down here had now been destroyed by this VN-20 of this platoon, this VN-20 firing its HJ-12E and destroying this tank before this action was occurring. And now as this tank came out finally and tried crossing, it was fired at by a tank shell, a heat round from the side, and a VN-20 from this moving up. IFV, this VN-20 here of this other platoon, firing at the same time and destroying this tank trying to move across into this area. As that happened, these vehicles then crossed the street and moved up, along with these tanks as well that had just gotten to this point, now moving up this way as well. They would have also been able to help with this, but by the time this tank fired and the VN-20 fired, it was over with. It was done. By which point this tank had already been destroyed as well by these tanks here. These tanks blocked them from getting too far into this area. They fired and destroyed them before this tank was finally destroyed as well. And as that happened, all of these armed civilians had already moved into this point and then finally came over into this area and were hiding in this rubble. Although the ISR network could see all the movement of all the American forces, they knew where they all were at all times. They knew they had gone into this area. The tanks decided to bypass them because they were more concerned with the remaining American armored vehicles and not so much armed reactionary civilians, which they would leave up to the mechanized infantry troops now leaving this building after clearing it and then going into this gutted building with this squad holding the outside, moving up as per SOP. Same with this squad that moved up alongside of the squads clearing the building on the outside of it on the north, moving up as well. As this building was gutted, these squads going in clearing it could see clear over to the other side. And they now engaged in a firefight back and forth with the Americans as the tanks were already now passing through this area, by which point there would be a small engagement between the tanks. As again mentioned earlier, by this point, this tank was firing at this tank here, causing them to start to flee the area. This action was happening at the same time as this was, after all of this had occurred here. At which point, also, these squads were moving into this building, clearing it, and now were clearing this building as well, with the VN-20 crossing the street, dropping off its squad that began behind it in a double column rolling shield right into this building, right as these squads crossed, and this squad peeled out to watch the north sector of fire and began to clear this building, which was now partially gutted from the tank shells fired into it by these tanks. At which point, as these tanks were leaving and going into this area here, and these armed reactionary American civilians were here, this small armored engagement began where this tank was right here and about to cross the street. These armed reactionary civilians fled just before this tank crossed, and this VN-20 all the way down the street spotted them crossing and fired their 30mm autocannon at them, and the 30mm autocannon annihilated all of them. Not this VN-20, rather, this QN-506 of the anti-tank company, of one of the platoons, of the two platoons from the anti-tank company fighting in this engagement. They destroyed all these armed reactionary civilians, which were already being engaged by this point, as indicated by the red on this rubble pile, causing them to flee as they had been spotted and engaged. And as that happened, right as this tank was moving across the street, it got to the corner, and this PLA tank was starting to focus on it and started to fire at it, and it pulled just behind the corner, and the shell slammed into the rubble pile, although it engaged the tank, because the tank was now partially damaged from this, as it took some minor damages in its armor as the vast majority of the sabot round shredded through the rubble, which somewhat broke its effectiveness, and it hit into the front right side of this tank facing this way and didn't do as much damage as it could have otherwise done, at which point this tank, which had moved up right here amid this rubble, although it was spotted, it was known that it was there, it peeled around here and it got a shot off from bore sighting around. Their crew was exceptionally fast. They put a DU round in and fired it right into this PLA tank, destroyed the tank. And while that happened, this tank had moved over here. And this tank that was watching their side flank, their northern flank of this tank that moved in here, of the two that had moved through this area, they fired into this tank and destroyed it before moving this direction here. When that happened, they, along with this tank moving in here, after having cut these armed reactionary civilians down that fled into this area earlier, both engaged and destroyed this tank. As the rubble was low enough where they could see the tank coming up over the rubble, they fired at it, destroyed it, along with this tank coming up on top of the rubble to fire at it, which caused this tank to flee in great haste. And now, at this point, after a short firefight had ensued between the armed reactionary civilian group that went into this rubble pile and these squads coming out of this gutted building, along with the squads on the edges right here, firing, laying down enormous volumes of fire on them, The last few surviving armed reactionary civilians had come out of the rubble and were cut down as they didn't know what else to do, as they decided to go out in a blaze of glory, and they were cut down for it, which led to then these two squads here, this one on the north on the outside while they were clearing the building as per SOP, tactically bounding and covering with them. This one bound ahead, drop, watch the sector of fire or lay down, suppressive fire. This one would bound, drop, do the same thing, so on and so forth, till they got in the rubble pile. And then this squad did the same thing going over here with the tank and the squad that moved up together right here by that point, moving across the street and stopping right here. The tank watching down here, the squad and this squad that had taken this edge of the building, now going into this pile together. So the two squads are in the pile. The tank was sitting right outside of the rubble in this parking lot watching this sector here. And now they were holding down these rubble piles with one squad going into this one, two going into this one, at which point this engagement had just concluded. This tank had been destroyed. These armed reactionary civilians were destroyed. And now these forces were laying down fire on these armed reactionary civilians here. At which point, as this tank was here, and this happened over here with this tank doing all these crazy maneuvers, trying to get out of the way while it was being fired at, the the mechanized infantry rather would, now that they were in these piles, give some support to their tank that was right here, and were beginning to fire at this tank from higher up on this rubble building, which was a bit taller of a rubble pile because it was a larger building than were most of these houses that were just random heaps of rubble now, as even concrete and asphalt were thrown in with them from the heavy strategic air raid. And they were firing down at this tank, which is why you see the red on the ends there. And it maneuvered quickly into this position and was now preparing to fight the tank that was shadowing it as it fired a shell towards this tank, which is why you see this green right here. This tank also maneuvered here and fired as well into this rubble. Both fired into the rubble and hit this rubble pile and not the PLA tank. Although the tank fired at this tank and destroyed it from the angle of fire, because the rubble over here was a bit shorter than was the rubble over here, which is a bit taller. As they fired and destroyed this tank, this Bradley had moved up and had been hit by an ISR-directed tank shell from this tank right here. Sorry, not this one. This one was Molotov. This one right here had hit it as it moved up into position, at which point this had already happened where these two dismounted squads of riflemen had moved up. This one had been KIA'd by mortar fire, and this one had been cut down by an S-507 loitering munitions strike. These tanks, again, were destroyed, as mentioned earlier. These guys were hit by ISR-directed shells, as were these vehicles. These tanks tried to move to get out of the way. Shells were slamming into the rubble, which partially protected them for a short time until they moved out in the open and were hit by tank shells and also the QN-502C anti-tank guided missiles, which also helped destroy the tanks that were out in the middle of the street, which were wiped out right away immediately. As that happened, as this tank was finally destroyed, this tank immediately turned and pulled out of this area, as this tank had already fired at it and the ISR assets knew they were there. While that happened, these squads were beginning, as this squad bounded over to this rubble pile, these two squads began to bound and cover tactically to take this final position of armed reactionary civilians right here. And as that was going on, this squad had already made it here. When these two squads started bounding and covering, they were going to do classic L-vectored fire on this position and destroy it. But by which time this tank that had been one of the two command tanks of the headquarters platoon, as the other one was destroyed by tank shell and ATGM, and these loitering munitions, CH-901As early on with the frag warheads, destroyed the vehicles and dismounts, as well as also other fires coming in like S-507 loitering munitions and ATGM fires, 125 millimeter heat shells and HE shells and frag shells that landed in this yard area that destroyed all this, including the armored recovery vehicle. This tank had moved here and had been temporarily protected by the rubble as it was right up against it, as indicated by the red, as shells were hitting this rubble pile. But then, when it moved over in this area and this tank moved here finally, this tank could have provided some support against the infantry a little bit. So although the infantry had anti-tank weapons, it still could have been a nuisance. That's why I say a little bit. Although this tank was now providing mutual support to its infantry as well. Although these weren't infantry, these were armed reactionary civilians. These were the mechanized infantry forces, and this tank was going to provide support to them by destroying this American tank that was already known where it was. I mean, it was not a secret, but when it moved here, this tank fired a shell directly into it because it had already opened fire on this tank first. So they'd already lost a tank. Their armored recovery vehicle that was on standby in the parking lot had already now since moved up and was hooking up the remains of this tank to its crane and hoisting it up and getting it hooked up to the recovery vehicle so it could pull it all the way back to the new FOB that was the William P. Hobby Airport, as that was being established as a new mega FOB. So this tank had been destroyed by this tank. And as that happened, this grouping right here of armed reactionary civilians had been fired at since down the street from the QN 506, same as this group had, same as even the tank had temporarily while this group was being fired at by 30 autocannon. The tank was also being fired at by that inadvertently while it was on this corner, which caused it to hurriedly flee the area. Although it did contribute to the destruction of this tank, as this tank was focusing on it, allowing this tank to destroy it, which caused the crew to be KIA'd and the tank to need recovery. But this tank destroyed this tank after it had already destroyed this one, causing this tank to flee again, as mentioned earlier. But it would eventually be destroyed by this tank pursuing it as this fled up this way. This same tank that destroyed this tank and this tank would pursue this tank as it fled in crazy maneuvering patterns throughout this area, trying to dodge all the shells and the missiles being fired into the area, 30-millimeter autocannon, the QN502Cs, which slammed into the rubble as it took position here, as indicated. But the tank was able to fire a shell over a lower portion of rubble and destroy this tank once it got here, and also then move up here and destroy this one as well. By that time that this bounding and covering was going on here, with these 3 squads taking out the last armed reactionary civilians and even getting into grenade range as they were being engaged right up until where they got up against these rubble piles and tossed grenades over the sides of the rubble as they got down real low right up near these armed reactionary civilians before they then fanned out and checked the area, including the destroyed tank for survivors in case any needed medical treatment, as they would take them as POWs if they were even still alive. But they checked and found no survivors as the tank fired a sabot round right into the front of it, and it bounced around inside and basically shredded up the crew inside, ripped them up. As all of that was occurring and the armored recovery was taking place, and all this action had occurred over here, including the clearance of these buildings, this entire industrial site, as the vehicles had all moved up and secured the area, including this manhole cover where the kamikaze platoon of civilians with Molotovs came from that Molotoved a PLA tank. The PLA had only lost 3 vehicles between 2 different companies from 2 completely different battalions, from 2 different group armies. As the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, not group armies, but Combined Arms Brigades of the 83rd Group Army. The 113th Combined Arms Brigade and the 60th Combined Arms Brigade each had a battalion in the area. The Mechanized Infantry Battalion was of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade. The 60th Combined Arms Brigade was the Armored Battalion, who only had 1 of its tank companies operating in the area and 2 of its 2 armored infantry companies of their combat elements, their 3 combat platoons each, with their headquarters platoons each off map. So essentially 3 full companies of the armored battalion were operating in this battle. The 2 armored infantry companies, 1 of the 4 tank companies, and half of the combat platoons of the anti-tank company of the QN-506s. There were only 10 QN-506s partaking directly in the combat, with the others staying on the perimeter with elements of this other tank company of the 3 that were forming the perimeter inside of the William P. Hobby Airport for the Air Defense Forces, logistical forces from the Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and the arriving mechanized infantry forces, of which this was one of the advanced companies of it, as in the first to arrive, with the others to move in and assist with the establishment of the perimeter, while this tank company, the 2 anti-tank company platoons of QN-506s, and the 2 armored infantry companies to provide their armored infantry support to the anti-tank company elements, as well as the tank company elements of the tank company that was partaking in the battle, worked together to destroy this grouping of armed reactionary civilians and the last real major combat forces in terms of maneuver forces that the Americans had, minus a very, very small number of artillerymen that were even alive and a tiny handful of their howitzers that had survived another Tu-22M strike in League City earlier. As those forces had fled League City by this point, as this battle was literally occurring, as they were fleeing to Alvin, Texas, directly to the west of League City, as League City was literally immediately off this map to the south of I-45, right here where it begins on this map in the core metro area. League City's right there if the map continued. And the PLAN Marines were moving into League City at about this time and would spend a number of hours there, approximately 5 hours, clearing Dickinson and League City of American reactionary civilian elements, which also forced the surviving military elements that had just survived a Tu-22M strategic air raid to flee west to nearby Alvin, where they would try to set up some kind of defense, albeit a very limited one, with their remaining resources, as they had lost essentially an enormous quantity of artillery howitzer shells they could have used. They had very few shells remaining. Not that it would matter, as by the time they would fire, it would almost guarantee an immediate counter-battery fire response or attack from the air by attack helo gunships, loitering munitions, aircraft when they returned, and even possibly cruise missile strikes from the sea, or even from the ground-based systems whenever a volley would be fired from the container-based cruise missile systems, as targeting data could be updated from here on out, as by this point in time, the main priority targets had all been but wiped out. So the targets for the container-based Caliber Club Ks and YJ-18Cs could henceforth be updated as targets changed. And if that even could pertain to any combat elements still left on the field, then those could be utilized against them as well, as the heavier elements of the PLAN 1st Marine Brigade were now fully ashore and were now entering League City and Dickinson and would begin the 5-hour-long battle to clear their way up and into and through that area before doing their massive sickle cut from there through Alvin to Richmond before moving up northeast up I-69 into the core metro area, as they would clear the outer suburbs before they would enter the core metro area. The final major battle would occur direct south of the core metro area in the Alvin outermost suburb, which was essentially a large town, in other words. It wasn't really even a city by standards of what a city was in terms of population, but it was a large town and actually a focal point of armed reactionary civilian resistance, at least in the outer suburbs. And the retreating American military forces, even a few additional mixed military forces, such as Coast Guard and naval personnel who had fled Texas City, Texas, that had even survived, would be entering Alvin to fight alongside of the Army National Guardsmen of the 1st of the 141st who had survived, along with their howitzers, as well as a large number of armed reactionary civilians who would attempt to put up a fight. However, the heavy PLAN forces and also even their air assault troops who had partaken in the early moments of the battle would be utilized in cutting off the retreat of many of these armed reactionary elements, as armed reactionary civilians in a large concentration with these mixed military forces would be the last remaining defenders in the entire metro area, in the inner metro area and outer metro area, as the downtown area would actually be the other last pocket to fall, but it would fall before the Alvin pocket, which would be the final pocket of the two to fall, as the PLAN Marines would actually bring the operation to capture Houston to a close and would fight in the last 2 hours of this 18-hour-long battle to capture the city and its entire metro area. As the air assault forces of the PLAN Marine Brigade, its air assault battalion, would be utilized in a manner similar to battles that occurred in the Vietnam War, where they would be flown in behind the retreat lines of possible retreat of American forces to cut off their retreat, while the heavier forces were moving in, coming from the east towards the west, as in they would come in and surround Alvin, and as they were in the process of surrounding it on three sides from the east and the north and the south, the air assault battalion would be flown in to the west of the town and dropped off to cut off any conceivable retreat for these elements, so that they would be fully surrounded before they even realized they were surrounded, using them again in a manner similar to many battles that occurred in the Vietnam War when air assault forces were first used.